So my name is Alan Schroeder. I am from Critical Care and Hospital Medicine, co-chair of this series, which is now going monthly, along with Dr. Roshni Mathew, who I'll introduce in a second. But first, just the standard housekeeping stuff with our text code for CME credit. Go ahead and enter that, and that will also be placed in the chat. And then our next open forum will be on June 3rd in about 3 or 4 weeks. And there probably will be another speaker or two added to that as well, as I will get to shortly, where as we are emerging into so many discussions about childhood vaccination and vaccine hesitancy, we are really interested in getting the perspectives of the folks at the front line in primary care who are having these discussions on a daily basis. So I am thrilled to have an amazing panelist today, an amazing panel today with many wonderful speakers who I will introduce now. The first is Hayley Gans, who is in pediatric infectious disease, the clinical professor there, and brings many things to the table, including a lot of work with the FDA on vaccine approval, and also expertise in vaccinating immunocompromised patients. Amna Khan, many of you will recognize as a former pediatric resident from here at Stanford, and has now been in primary care at Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, which is our safety net institution for the entire county. Amna has done incredible work on outreach and vaccine equity. She's wearing some of her swag today, and we look forward to hearing about your efforts, Amna. Yvonne Maldonado, I think needs very little introduction. Thank you, Bonnie, for being such a consistent presence and voice on this panel. As many of you know, she's the chief of infectious disease, also the chair of the Committee on Infectious Disease for the American Academy of Pediatrics. Roshni Mathew, my co-chair, recent winner of the Impact Award for our medical staff. Yay, Roshni, and also in infectious disease and runs our infection control efforts. And then lastly, Elizabeth Stuart, who is in the Division of General Pediatrics here and spends time at Gardner Clinic as a general pediatrician, as a clinical professor of pediatrics. Elizabeth, I hear over and over again from residents how good she is about having these types of conversations with families, particularly around hesitancy. So really looking forward, Elizabeth, to getting your perspective on that. We can go ahead and unshare, Ingrid, and then Roshni is going to start this session by just reviewing, as we've done for several of the last sessions, some of the local and national data as pertains to children. So take it away, Roshni.
Thank you, Alan. So I figured I would talk about the landscape of COVID-19 as well as a little bit about the vaccination rollout status. So just wanted to share the global toll of COVID-19. This is a very famous website now from Johns Hopkins. So 159 million global cases. US still with the highest number of 32 million. India, though, closely behind at 23 million. But as you've heard, with rapid increases in their numbers every day now. And the death toll on the right, with over 500 million deaths in the United States. This is the CDC's COVID tracker. I just pulled this up because it's interesting to see the age groups that represent the COVID-19 cases. In the beginning of the pandemic, this purple line represents 80 years and over. So they represented the highest number of cases. That's probably because they were tested the most. But then you can see quickly the people who represent the highest number of cases are this age group of 18 to 54. So they are the highest contributors to COVID-19 cases. But then you can see this dark yellow line as well. And that's the 14 to 17 years of age. And they also contribute to number of cases in COVID-19. Thankfully, the trend is really reassuring, and we all know why that is. Because of the vaccine rollout that happened in January, and really impacting the oldest age groups first, because they were the first ones to get the vaccine. This curve is the number of deaths and the age groups where that has occurred. And as we know, it is the oldest age groups that have been most impacted by deaths. And you can see, again, a very reassuring trend over the past few months. This is the American Academy of Pediatrics information on COVID in children. Children represent 3.8 million cases of COVID-19, and that's 14% of the total cases in the United States. They now represent, over the last week, they represent 24% of all the cases. And hospitalizations, again, overall, children, it has been reassuring that children did not represent a large number of hospitalizations or deaths, but as Bonnie had reminded us last week during the grand rounds, that the cumulative child deaths actually is 306, which for children is still a high number. In terms of COVID-19 vaccinations, we do need to look at what's happening all over the world, because what happens in the United States alone is irrelevant, because we are such a closed community now all over the world. So this represents the percentage of population in the different countries that are fully vaccinated. So the United States is here with 35% of our population that is fully vaccinated. And you can see what is happening in India, although they are trying really hard to vaccinate their population. With 1.4 billion people, only 2.8% of the population is fully vaccinated. This is a little bit more about California. California, again, we have vaccinated 35.8% of our total population. 51% of the population has received at least one vaccine. And that's a population of 14 million who are already fully vaccinated. And this is Santa Clara County. We are actually doing quite well. 73% of our eligible population, this is actually 16 and over. So this changes today, basically, because people are vaccinating 12 and over. 73% of 16 and over have received at least one dose, and 52% are fully vaccinated. This is from CDC again, and I just want to hone in on the less than 18. So this is 16 and 17 years old, kids that are fully vaccinated. That's 1 million have already received their full vaccination. And this is, this just ties in with the approval of the vaccine, the Pfizer-BioNTech for the 12 to 15 years old that happened 2 days back, and then CDC approved it yesterday. And so we do have the opportunity to vaccinate at Stanford Children's Health, and these are the locations, and they do need to do, these are scheduled appointments. And that's all my slides.
Really helpful, Roshni, thank you so much. And we're going to probably spend most of today talking about vaccination. I'm seeing some questions coming in about the news today about the CDC is going to sort of reverse some of their mask recommendations and distancing recommendations. So we will try to get to some of that at the end of the session if we can, but I really do want to focus on vaccination today. And of all the numbers that Roshni just showed, what I had not fully appreciated was the total numbers of 16 to 17-year-olds that have already received the vaccination. I think you said 1 million have had 2 shots, but I think it's something like 2 million have had 1 shot. And that, I think as we get into now talking about safety and concerns for younger groups, I at least find it very reassuring that we've had so many vaccines already given to the older population. But what I'd like to do now, maybe Bonnie has turned to you, and Hayley, please feel free to jump into some of this too. But Bonnie, would you mind just reviewing some of the data from Pfizer on vaccination, how we got to the EUA and then the ACIP's recommendation on Wednesday, and maybe just again recapping your perspective on the risk-benefit profile of this vaccination.
Yeah, so sure. I don't know if Hayley's had a chance to see the data. I'm sure she has, but we saw the data. The Red Book Committee had a meeting with the company 2 weeks ago, and they showed us their data under a non-disclosure agreement. And So we had a chance to review it again with CDC. What's today? Yesterday. And but essentially what happened was the company actually started their trials last year, and they had already started enrolling 16-year-olds and decided also to then drop the age down to 12 to 15-year-olds. Maybe Hayley has more information about how that is. We did talk a little bit to the company about their decision just to expand the age groups. But when they went for the first emergency use authorization, they really only included the 16 to 18-year-old data in addition to the adult data. But they continued to follow the 12 to 15-year-olds. So they had over 2,200 children in the 12 to 15-year-old studies. And of course, it was the typical study that we saw with the adults with randomized 1-to-1 placebo-controlled trials, and the adult dose of 30 micrograms in 2 doses given 21 days apart. And the what they were going to do was what we call an immunobridging study, which is really to look at the percent of kids who were going to have an immune response, measuring antibody titers, basically. And because of the concern, and most vaccines, as we all know, don't have efficacy data because it's really hard to enroll enough kids to do efficacy trials, meaning you can't enroll thousands and thousands of kids when the prevalence of diseases are not in the millions like it is for COVID-19. So most studies in kids tend to be immunobridging, and usually you'd like to, but you don't always have a correlate of protection. So in that situation, the FDA usually has to work with the company to decide what is the immune surrogate marker for protection, even if you don't actually have one. So for example, right now, we don't know what a protective titer is or isn't. You would think we would know by now, but we don't have that number yet. But so they're just looking at neutralizing antibody titers and comparing them to adults and saying, you know, here's what it looks like for adults. And they looked at what they called equivalence or non-inferiority. They're 2 different calculations, but you basically look and say, if it's not worse than adults, and there's a statistical way to do those. And so they did calculate that. In fact, what they found was that the titers in kids were about they were higher. They were about 1.5 times higher than the titers in adults. But the 95% confidence intervals were not statistically higher than adults, although they were right on the cusp, but very close, but just right under the cusp, but still pretty high. And that goes along, and Hayley can talk about this, but kids do mount very robust immune responses. So anyway, so the data looked very good. From the immunity standpoint, the kids had non-inferiority compared to adults in terms of antibody responses. What we hope to see in the future are neutralizing antibody assays as well, that they're continuing to do right now, so we can look more deeply into the degree of immunity, and then maybe some data, anyway, other data that we can talk about later. But the other important piece that I think was nice to have, but was not expected, was that there were still enough cases in the 2,200 kids vaccinated versus placebo that they were able to calculate a efficacy, which means the ability of the vaccine to prevent infection. And this was symptomatic PCR confirmed infection. So we still don't have data on asymptomatic infection, although there are a number of studies in adults now, and the CDC's meeting yesterday provided a whole list of those. And so what happened was they found 0 cases of disease, symptomatic PCR confirmed disease in the vaccinees of the 2,200 plus kids who were enrolled total in the vaccinated group, compared to 10 cases in the unvaccinated group, or the placebo group, sorry. And the confidence intervals around that were like 75% to 100%. So basically this looks like the vaccine is going to be as effective in kids as it is in adults.
And at least the little we've seen for Moderna, same mRNA vaccine mechanism, look similarly reassuring.
Yeah, the data for that group, I think it's something like 94%, some 92, 94%. They didn't give us numbers. So, but it still looks pretty good.
I think they had 12 total infections and they randomized 2 to 1. So a little bit of a different efficacy calculation. But so we now have, so Hayley, we now have at least, you know, in several thousand patients, reasonably, well, quite convincing data about efficacy, albeit with a small number of cases. We can talk about safety. I'd like to hear you guys' perspective about safety, but maybe you can also just sort of summarize how you then see this from an overall risk-benefit profile for 12 to 15-year-olds.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Alan. I think it's really important to remember in context of what's happening, not only globally, but in our country. We are in a pandemic. And so while these, I think, would be exciting results in the world of vaccinology in general, in the context of what we're seeing right now and the idea that we really need to get the transmission of the virus down to the point that we can all start going back to normal activity. So this idea that enough immunity has to happen in our population so that the virus will no longer be able to circulate is really an important aspect of how we need to vaccinate our population, which obviously includes children. So the idea that we need to vaccinate them in order to not only protect them individually, but to protect our whole population is really an important part of what we're trying to do with the goals of vaccination for children. So when we look at it in terms of that, then we start looking at, as Bonnie explained, the immunogenicity or the response to it, but we also look at safety. So what is that risk balance? And the safety, as we saw in the adult studies, actually is quite great. You know, there are some adverse side effects that we see with the actual vaccination itself, which are short-lived. Children also are experiencing those, but those haven't been thought to any of those risks haven't been thought to outweigh the huge benefits that this will have, not only for the individual, but also the society as a whole.
But, you know, one of the most commonly voiced concerns is that the safety signals are sometimes very rare, right? If you look at Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca and the clot, it took, you know, unrolling this to the population to see these 1 in 200,000 to 1 in a million very serious risks. So what can we tell parents that can make them feel better about the fact that we only have a couple thousand kids in these trials?
So can I make a comment about that? Because that's an epidemiologic question too. I may have failed to mention it, but you don't need 30,000 or 40,000 people to calculate efficacy. That's actually a misunderstanding in the way these trials were done. And I think these were highly robust trials. I don't think we ever have seen, well, other than pneumococcal, the first Prevnar studies before it was even called Prevnar, that study enrolled 44,000 people. But that's because the endpoints were very soft, like otitis media and pneumonia, in addition to meningitis. And meningitis, remember, was not, well, you may all not remember this, but it wasn't highly prevalent, so you needed larger numbers. But for COVID, for most vaccine trials, or any trial really, for efficacy, you don't need tens of thousands of people. You only need a few thousand actually to calculate efficacy. Sample
just
sizes.
to clarify, Bonnie, to clarify, we were talking about safety.
No, I know. Let me finish.
Okay.
Not done. So the issue around this is, if you're looking for efficacy, you don't need thousands. For safety, and we heard this directly because I talked to the head of the the CDC head of ACIP. We discussed this at length, and FDA as well. The question is, at this point, these vaccines have been given to over 200 million people. We have a pretty good idea of the safety signals. If anybody wants to get the data, you can actually go in to the VAERS website, VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, and you can look up the numbers. If you want to look at tables and not have to figure it out yourself, you can go to the CDC website and just search for ACIP, and there are the slides from yesterday's meeting are posted and from the previous meetings. And the VAERS website has shown the risk of side effects, and they're extremely low. So granted, people are going to say, well, what about in children? Are they different than in adults? And I'll let Hayley talk to that issue around immunologic stuff. But we have a really broad, these vaccines have been studied way more than any other vaccine, even for other children, because we're talking about hundreds of millions of doses already. So, and 1 billion doses of vaccines plus in the world for all of the different types of vaccines. The safety signals are so low. Yes, there have been some cases of Bell's palsy reported, but they are not higher in the vaccinated group compared to placebo group, et cetera. So I think obviously the wording from the AAP will be important. The wording from all of the pediatricians here will be important. And there are FAQs that are already posted on the AAP website for families to look at and for pediatricians to use as toolkits. But I'll hand it off to Hayley because she really was focusing on the safety issues.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. I think you raised really important issues. And I think it is important to realize in the context of historical, this is one of the most studied vaccines that was ever brought to market. And these obviously are being used in a different way for emergency use, but already have much more robust data than we're used to looking at as we sit on these FDA committees. So it's really important to understand that. But I think one of the most important issues around this is our amazing surveillance systems that we actually have in place. So as these 1 million doses are rolling out, it's not just that people are sitting back passively waiting for reporting to happen around those. There's actually active surveillance. And I think the whole issue with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine actually proves that our systems are working really well. So those very rare events actually were noted and were studied and were analyzed. So the idea that rare events won't be picked up, I think in today's world with our surveillance systems actually is not the case, and that we feel very fortunate to be able to have these systems in place for this particular vaccine, which is being given at a scale and scope that isn't typically seen with vaccines. But it allows us obviously to pick up rare events in a more timely way just because of how many people are receiving that. So I don't have particular concerns in the pediatric population per se. Children tend to actually tolerate all of these vaccines better than actually adults do. And so without a lot of the comorbidities and other things that we're seeing in adults that may precede some of the adverse outcomes, we're not seeing, we don't have that baseline background information in children.
The question that I think surfaces most often is these are children going through puberty. There are, somehow people have started worrying about fertility. I know that everything we've seen about fertility in older patients who have gotten the vaccine has been very encouraging. But can you guys just review the mechanism of this vaccine again and sort of give us our talking points for why this age group, which people perceive as being more vulnerable, why we can be reassured about that?
Yeah, so let me just tell you the thing about primary fallopian failure. Primary fallopian, failure. I can't remember the acronym. That has been around just about as long as I can remember. The AAP, there's actually a group that has called themselves AAP, so people can think that it's the AAP, but it stands for some other group, American Association of Pediatricians or something like that. And this is a very interesting group. I won't talk about what their background looks like, but they are a small group of very anti-vax people, and they hold a number of other issues as well. And they've been bringing up this idea that like HPV vaccine causes primary fallopian failure, other vaccines as well. And this is just a series, another in a series of things that the groups like that have done. There are things like TikTok challenges right now where people are putting magnets on their skin to show that there's microchips in the vaccine. So let's categorize those all together and think about how how we want to deal with those. And I think pediatricians are very good at knowing how to talk to families about safety issues. So I think this is really important. So let me go back, and Hayley can also weigh in because she spent a lot of time looking at the data also. So these are mRNA vaccines. We actually, for International Women's Day, my office of Faculty Development and Diversity, we have an annual lecture that celebrates women scientists, and we invited Melissa Moore, who is one of the senior scientists at Moderna, and she came to speak about mRNA vaccines. And that platform has been available for many years. It's not a new platform. It's just that in the context of vaccines that work the way they work, there's a lot of ennui around trying to move to new platforms when you have something that already works. And so it's just like flu vaccines. There were a number of new platforms for flu vaccines that could have been rolled out, but people just felt like they were using the vaccines that they knew and they were familiar with. What happened with the COVID pandemic is, since we didn't have a vaccine for this particular disease, we didn't know about it, there was an opportunity to create innovative uses of existing platforms. And the mRNA technology has been around for a while. mRNAs were discovered in 1960. The platform has been studied for at least 20 years now. And the way it works essentially is mRNAs they're synthesized in the cytoplasm of the cell, in the human cell. And then they migrate to the cytoplasm where they live, and they serve as a template for protein synthesis. And then they immediately disintegrate. They fall apart right away. In fact, they're so unstable. That's why you have to coat them with lipid and put them in -70. So these are not hardy pieces of nucleic acid structures. They're quite delicate. So what the companies have done is they've created synthetic mRNAs. That is, these are not from animals, they're not from humans, they are just synthetic RNA pieces that have been linked together in the sequence that codes for the spike protein. And they're encased in a lipid nanoparticles to keep them stable while they are being injected. Once they're injected, they're taken up by the cell. They'd never go to the cytoplasm. The nucleus. They're never in the nucleus. They stay in the cytoplasm. The lipid falls off. They are immediately used as templates for spike protein. As soon as the template is used, it falls apart. It's very, very transient. Falls apart into its nucleic acid pieces, and then those are degraded and gone. They don't travel around the body. They stay in the location of the shot of the injection. And they don't integrate into our own, you would imagine, they don't integrate into our DNA or RNA. So what happens then is the spike protein that your own body has created out of your own protein or amino acids from this little synthetic template, then will be used as an immunogen for your immune response. So that's my own way to explain it. So, there are ways you can explain this to people by saying that this is a synthetic piece of RNA that looks like what our bodies normally produce, but it's not produced with human or animal or live tissues. It's not a live virus. It's nothing in it is alive or made from live components. It's injected, the fat falls off. It is used to create little spike proteins, and then it falls apart and is gone. And then those spike proteins elicit an immune response. So Hayley, I don't know what you want to say.
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to address is that the idea of the link between this particular vaccine and pregnancy-related outcomes or fertility. So this is the spike protein as Bonnie described, and there is a very short amino acid part of that protein that actually is similar to some of the placental proteins. It's just not long enough for anyone to make a specific immune response to that then would actually impact the placenta. So the ideas that were generated early on, which were only ideas, have actually not bore out in A, the science, and B, all of the people who have actually received the vaccine. The other component that I just wanted to address, because you raised it, Alan, is the idea of blood clots. So these messenger RNA vaccines are not associated as the J&J one, which is not obviously the one that we're considering for this age group to be associated with blood clots. So I don't think we have to worry about those in this age group.
Okay, well, let's now move a little bit to how we have these conversations with families. We got, I think, some tips there. Obviously, how we convey this is going to depend to some extent on health literacy. Amna, tell us about the work that you've done. Obviously, at this point, a lot of it has been with around messaging to adults, but now we're starting to vaccinate kids. Tell us what you're doing.
Well, thank you guys so much, first and foremost, for the invitation to come and share with you the vaccine equity work that we've been doing at Santa Clara Valley Medical Center. As general pediatricians who talk all day, every day about vaccinations, we were primed and ready to use our role as trusted messengers in the community to advocate for this vaccine, especially after the population that we serve at Valley is a considerably vulnerable population. And we've heard countless stories of devastating things that have been occurring in our community that have permanently affected these families due to the pandemic. So not only were we fighting for access in terms of placing mass vaccination sites in the zip codes in Santa Clara County that have been greatly affected, most affected by COVID, which include East San Jose and also Gilroy. But we were also using every clinical encounter with patients and their families to start from the very beginning talking about COVID vaccination. And those conversations started in December and initially were about vaccinating your elders if you lived in a multi-generational home, and then continued on to vaccinating essential workers, since many of our parents work in very public facing professions where they ran a greater risk of contracting COVID. And we definitely saw that over and over again in our patients, our patient families. And what we noticed in starting these conversations early is, one, our patients were always surprised that their medical institution had already been vaccinated. From the receptionists to the medical assistants to the nurses to the physicians, many of our patients didn't realize that we had had our own personal experience with COVID vaccination and that we were vaccinated safely and effectively. Not only that, we were also fielding all of the questions that have been, all of the concerns that have been discussed already, many concerns about long-term effects of fertility and sterility, mistrust of a vaccine that was generated by a government that they did not feel was advocating for them specifically, and also misunderstanding of how the immune system works. So thinking, I'm not going to get vaccinated with this vaccine because I've heard there's a lot of secondary effects, and I'm not sure if that means then I'm infected with COVID. So a lot of education around those things. But what we recognized was that we could have these one-on-one conversations with our patients all day long, and they were effective, but we didn't have any global messaging to our community about our promotion of the vaccine and our belief in the vaccine being safe and effective to protect our communities of patients. We obviously serve an incredibly large Latinx community here at Santa Clara Valley, a very large monolingual Spanish-speaking population, and there was no Spanish signage anywhere. And we really recognized that that was something that we needed to work together to create. So three of us, myself, Dr. Beatriz Mares, and also one of our fantastic RDs in the clinic, Pamela Cabrera Milburn. We sat down, the three of us. We have absolutely no graphic design experience or marketing experience, but we knew what the concerns of the community were, and we knew that we could collaboratively come up with a message that would be understood by the community. So we have three slogans with corresponding graphics, two that are in mass production right now. Coincidentally, today, as the Department of Pediatrics here at Valley, we are all wearing our vaccine equity shirts as a motion of solidarity for vaccine equity. And I'm wearing the first slogan right here. We made buttons, which we know in campaigns to promote vaccines in the past has been a really effective way to message to patients. So the first slogan is Ama, Confia, Protege, Vacúnate contra COVID, which translates to love, trust, and protect. And we are also wearing shirts. Now, we wear them in the clinic in order to message to families here, but also pediatricians were being pulled and asked to go to our mass vaccination sites. And so this allows us to identify ourselves as Spanish speakers and also ability to answer your questions in your native language if you would like. The second slogan, I hope you can see behind me, that we have put into development that is now posters that we have plastered all over the clinic from the reception when patients first come in to the entry doors, to the clinic exam rooms, to where kids are measured and weighed. That slogan is Vacunarse es una muestra de amor, which is translated to vaccinating yourself is an act of love. And the graphics that we use, the colors that we use, the messaging that we use, all very intentional. We came to the campaign wanting to focus on an asset-based perspective. So we wanted to highlight to our communities what you gain from vaccinating versus what you lose if you don't vaccinate. We understood already that there has been incredible fear around the pandemic, and we really wanted to highlight the family, because in Latinx communities and our communities of color, family is the whole reason to vaccinate yourself, to protect yourself, to reunite with your family after hopefully the pandemic is quelled, so you can go back to that lifestyle, which we've all acknowledged is what their providers want desperately as well. So that is one project that we've worked on. The second project was started by our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee on the institution level, and that was recruitment of BIPOC providers to create vaccine educational videos where you're speaking to your own community about the benefits of vaccination. And I'm happy to say that all of the things that we've talked about just in this COVID discussion today were questions and answers that we included in those videos. We have one video that was developed by our African American, African ancestry providers at the hospital in internal medicine that was geared towards that community. And then Dr. Amares did the Spanish one for Latinx, and I did the English version for Latinx communities, where we discussed a little bit of the science with an appropriate medical literacy examination, and also all of the questions so that patients could refer back to that video if they were trying to convince a family member to get vaccinated or refer back with their own questions. Those are available on YouTube and have been circulated by our public health department and also by our county supervisors. So we know that this is a continuous conversation. We've done countless other things in the clinic in order to ensure that making appointments for our patients is easy and accessible, taking away any boundary in terms of accessing that appointment. There is a digital divide. A lot of our patients only have access to a smartphone and cannot be on the internet all day long waiting to access an appointment. So we help by creating those appointments for them. And our goal is always to continue having very compassionate conversations about COVID-19 vaccination, to listen, to counsel, to educate, and then to vaccinate as many as we can. And based on the demographic information that Dr. Mathew presented, we have access to the age group that in Santa Clara County is the least vaccinated right now, and it has the highest risk of COVID infection. So we feel really wonderful that we have trusted, continuous relationships with these families so that we can answer your questions. We may not get it on the first interface, but this is an ongoing conversation that we have, and we feel like we're getting good traction by doing this multifaceted approach.
I think 75% of our pediatric hospitalizations at Packard have been patients that are Hispanic Latinx, which is incredibly disproportionate to the population in our county. Do you have any, just quickly, any brief sense for what uptake is going to be in the 12 to 15-year age range in your population?
I have a sense that if parents have been vaccinated themselves, that will get greater traction if they've had a positive experience. But sterility and fertility is a huge topic here with our patients, and we're trying to anticipate what the questions might be, and being here today and getting the background information also helps us educate our parents. But I do think that the parents who themselves have been hesitant, I think are inclusively going to be even more hesitant to vaccinate. But we're going to continue having the conversation, and hopefully the relationship of being a part of the family will allow us to engage.
Well, incredible work, Amna, and a nice segue, Elizabeth, to you. I think I'd love to hear how you have these conversations, how you frame these things, how you sort of meet the family where they are. Tell us how to do this. And you're muted.
I'll unmute first. It's great to listen to all of it, and particularly the systems level kind of push out into the community. I think that I feel most equipped to just think about it in terms of individual families who express concerns and who are hesitant. And I don't know that I have any really fantastic practical tips, but I will say one thing, that my sort of frame for vaccine hesitancy in general and how to approach it starts with an awareness of the fact that medicine is a culture, and we have values and rules and priorities, beliefs, if you want to call it that, that may not be shared by patients, often are, but not necessarily. And so a lot of the time what you're doing is sort of trying to cross a cultural divide. And just in listening to the whole sort of beginning, what's being put forward to a group of mostly physicians is a lot of really amazing science that I'm sitting and writing down all the facts and thinking, how do I translate that to straightforward explanations to families? And yet it feels so compelling to me to hear the science. But not all the patients who come in with a fear of something bad that might happen to their child receiving a vaccine, the science isn't compelling in the same way. And I think that, so it's important to start with acknowledging that. And I think sometimes there's a sense of bewilderment. I've given you all the information. I've given it to you as simply as I can. There's 1,000 million people who have done just fine. Why is that not meaningful to you? And I think ultimately, if you're talking with somebody who is afraid of something, you're dealing with fear that is not, you can't say, well, there's no science to back up your fear. Your fear is not evidence-based. It's just, it doesn't do very much. And I think the more you push it and the more authoritarian you become with it, it doesn't really gain more trust. It sort of pushes away and creates more of a distance. And so I think that's kind of what I have in mind usually when I'm talking with families who are expressing a fear about vaccines. And it's all completely, the fear that one family has is completely different from someone else. And the amount of information or the type of information is very different. So it really boils down to, what have you learned? What have you heard? What have you read? Where? What do you need? How close are you to being on the fence about this? Are you absolutely far away from even considering this, or are you kind of maybe but leaning towards, no, I don't want to vaccinate? How can I get you to be more towards on the fence? And then over time, can we get you to tip over? And it's a little bit, in primary care in particular, it's a relationship that you've had for a while, hopefully, or need to maintain to be able to really be helpful. And so keeping that in mind. And so those are sort of my principles. And I think that for me, individually myself, the fun thing about COVID to think about, maybe it's not fun, but it's different, because I feel a little bit of a lightness with Prevnar or MMR. You can sort of sit for a little bit and feel less pressure, more capacity to let the patient slowly come to hopefully a place of accepting the vaccine. COVID feels more urgent, and yet it's different in the sense from the patient's point of view that this has been an emergency use, rapid development, not as much experience with it. And so some of our usual arguments may not feel useful, and yet we're in sort of a crisis and need to push a little bit. So it's sort of different in that sense. The argument that you're helping the broad population by vaccinating your child, I think is very compelling for some families, and worth, like, I think we should avoid assuming that we should focus entirely on the benefit to you and your family. That's there, but I do think that for some people, if they really can understand what it is that they're contributing to, I think that that may be really important to emphasize. So those are my thoughts.
Very wise words. Let's
And I just want to add one other thing, because I think that what Amna and Elizabeth said are really powerful, and really what the two of them said is really what is going to make a difference in getting kids and their families engaged, because they're really dealing with, translating all of the science and the numbers into something that people can understand. But one thing that I want to point out is that if you look at data around who parents are listening to, they're listening to their pediatricians. So the power really is here, right? In those two discussions, because that's who they're going to listen to.
I was gonna for all of the participants ask to maybe go through a simulation. One of the questions we got submitted beforehand was by a mother of a 12-year-old, and she said that my daughter is a little bit underweight and has not yet had her period. Should she get the vaccine? So who wants to go first? And obviously you don't know this mom yet, and don't know what her sort of where she is from a health literacy perspective. And Elizabeth, I think that's what you would say would be the first step, is to sort of ascertain those things. But how would talk me through that conversation?
Maybe before Elizabeth answers that specific one, because I'm sure she'll have a very good approach to that. I did just want to make a point to Elizabeth's point about emergency use, and also the idea that is out in the public, and that these were sort of rapidly brought to market. I think that going back to the issue that these were really rigorous scientific clinical studies that brought these vaccines to market was not the part that was rushed. And so I think it's really important to sort of decouple the idea of how the manufacturing happened, which actually was brought to market much more quickly than typically, and the fact that the risk for the companies was offset so that the government could actually help fund some of that. So I think it's really important for people to not associate emergency use with something that we're doing experimental. And also a rush in the process was not the scientific rush. So I just want to point those things out, because I think it's helpful to distinguish that for the public.
Thank you. Yeah, important. Anyone want to reassure this mother of her 12-year-old and her safety of getting vaccinated?
I mean, I'm getting this question already from friends and family, not so much in the patient realm yet, but I'm sure it's coming. And if I did have a relationship with this preteen, I would definitely include them in this discussion and ask them, is there anything, I don't know if the mom is asking or if the teen has presented with any questions or anxiety. We know that teens, all kids are having sort of a mental health crisis right now over being closed in during the pandemic and the ramifications of that. I think kids are incredibly, especially at 12, kind of able to say, like, even just a basic worry about what is that worry. And I think addressing that worry that they might have with their parent there is very influential. and then going through the science about how there is no data that might also be influential depending upon who the family is. And something else that I wanted to add, because I agree with Elizabeth, that at least for my patient population, citing AAP and ACOG, that means nothing. That's like a data dump, and that doesn't translate for anything for them. So what I have found personally that I feel very comfortable doing, because I do have longstanding relationships with a lot of my patients now, and they've gotten to know me over many, many years, and they know who I am as a mother and as a wife, not just as a physician, is I use my personal experience. So I have an almost 12-year-old daughter, and I could reassure both mom and patient that if I was potentially to make this decision, that I would feel really confident as a mom to make that decision. And that all of my work this year, all of my motivation this year has definitely been also influenced by my personal life. And when I decided to vaccinate myself, when my husband decided to vaccinate himself as a physician as well, we took into consideration all the things that you're thinking about. And so I understand the stresses that come with making these decisions, but I feel so confident in the science that I made that personal decision myself.
Awesome. Any other?
I think that a comment that was brought up earlier too is that the risk of getting the disease is not gone. And so this child is at risk for actually being exposed to COVID themselves. And so talking a little bit about that. And as we open up, that risk is going to go up for this individual. So, children have been relatively quarantined and haven't been able to do the activities that they normally do. And so how do we most effectively and safely get this, get to individual immunity? You really want to have the vaccine immunity rather than natural disease immunity. And so describing the difference between those also might be helpful to individuals who are deciding how to weigh their risk.
So one other comment I would make is around multi-generational households and multi-family households. And we know that our communities of color in particular in lower socioeconomic areas really do have higher density homes, and they're also in smaller footprints. So more people, more crowded together. And there have been a few studies looking at that, and there's definitely a correlation with the infection rates within households. And so when I think it was Elizabeth, I can't remember now, who said that, thinking about the community, I would even say making it even more, hit it closer to home, I grew up with my grandmother in the household and personally, and I remember, she was healthy, obviously, but we all, that was part of our nuclear family. And I think that kids may be asymptomatic. They're more likely to be asymptomatic. In fact, I think that's the real downfall of this. This disease is sneaky this virus is sneaky in a lot of ways. But one of the critical things about it is that it does lull one into a sense of complacency, because most people really don't get that sick. 40% of people don't have symptoms at all. 40% might have a mild flu-like illness, which I think most people are willing to put up with. But that's exactly why this virus has been able to really, travel as quickly and as in-depth as it has. And so if you tell people, talk to them about the risk of a child becoming asymptomatically infected and potentially infecting somebody in the family who could be at higher risk for serious disease. And we know the data on the serious illnesses that can happen in high-risk populations, those over 50, especially those over 65, and people with underlying conditions.
I think the only thing that I would add to sort of tap into the power of all the different arguments is really to sort of say, I mean, the question as you asked it, Alan, was, do you recommend that my daughter get this vaccine? This is what I've heard or I'm worried about. And the first thing that you say, at least for me, is yes, I do. No question, I recommend the vaccine. Now, tell me what you've heard. Tell me who you live with. Tell me what you're thinking. And and then jump into wherever there's a space that's going to work for that family. I think it's really, you gain more power when what you're talking about is tailored to the person right in front of you, and the fact that they do have a grandparent or several other people who are working adults who will lose their, you know, time at work if they get sick and so forth. And knowing that, asking the questions, I think is just helps a lot.
Great. Well, we're down to about 4 or 5 minutes. Roshni, you have been furiously answering questions in the Q&A, and I really appreciate that. So for folks that are on the call here, please feel free to read through some of those answers. I want maybe, Roshni, you can, if you want to just summarize lots of questions about the CDC recommendations around distancing and masking for vaccinated. Do you want to just quickly summarize what you've been answering?
Yeah, so I mean, thanks to the webinar, now I know the CDC just gave that update today. I usually get my updates this way. So I was reading through it, and I am obviously trying to figure out how to now put that into practice. Obviously, I'm thinking more from healthcare's perspective. So just to answer that very quickly, just because CDC gives out a guidance does not mean that we can quickly implement that in a healthcare setting. We are bound by so many other authorities. So we have the California Department of Public Health, Santa Clara Department of Public Health, OSHA. So there are so many regulatory bodies that have also to align with that guidance. So it's only then that visitation and how we gather in conference rooms and all of that will change in a healthcare setting. But personally, so there are so many questions about what do we do in a household if you have fully vaccinated adults, can children younger than 12 gather together without masking? I just feel like we still have to use common sense. You know, if it's not 100% efficacious. So there is always breakthrough infections in spite of being vaccinated. So I do think that we have to still follow the usual rules that if you're sick, you don't gather. Great to gather outside, maybe in the beginning, as we are not still at 80% fully vaccinated. So, you know, we are still there catching up. I do think that people are tired, and so CDC has to put out give some hope to everybody. And I do think they are coming from that angle. So I do think that I don't think we know exactly how to operationalize all of these guidance that are coming so quickly at us. That was a major question. Another one was about the J&J vaccine, the finding of the clot as an adverse effect, and how long does it take for some of these to be identified. And I didn't know if Hayley, you wanted to comment. I know that we don't have a crystal ball in our hands. So
yeah, well, several of the surveillance systems that have been put into place actually are in real time. And so they actually get the signal fairly quickly, and then they have to look into it. So there was also a comment in there, is theirs confirmed? No, theirs, as people know, anybody can report to it. And then that information actually is taken and investigated. So they try to see if there actually is a link. And those signals in theirs are just what actually give us sort of an idea of maybe what we should be looking at in these other very large symptoms that actually are looking at millions and millions of doses in real time prospectively. So I don't know the exact timeline to what that would be, but I can tell you that the signals are being reported almost in real time.
So Tom Shimikaburo is really in charge of a lot of these systems at CDC, and they're called real-time cycle analysis, and they mean real time, like today. If you post something today that looks different from, so if you say fever or, you know, sore arm, they'll see it. But if you say something that's really different and unusual, they'll see that too. These things are evaluated as they come in. And then what they do is they go back and they request medical records if they can get them. I took the question a little differently. What happens with the clots is they don't happen right away. They happen about 6 to 10 days after the vaccination. So the timing of the clots themselves is not right after the shot. It's about a week later, which really, you know, again, I think people were worried about wondering, is it, how do you, how would you keep somebody there for an extra long period of time after vaccination, but really doesn't happen right away. But the surveillance systems the VAERS in particular has not only a website where you can report, but they have a phone number where you can report. And the other one that's called VSD, that's actually the longer term. That's the one that evaluates things over long terms and collects data over time. That's much slower. It's more in depth, but it's slower, but there's a rapid cycle analysis that happens right away.
Well, we're a little over. We're going to do this again. We'll talk about a lot of the same things in early June. So please join us again there. I'd like to thank all of our guests for providing such valuable insight into an exciting time. Thank you all.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.